Okay, welcome everyone to the first University of Texas Energy Symposium of the spring 2023 semester. Happy New Year to everyone. I'm Kerry King, your host, Assistant Director and Research Scientist of the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas at Austin. And before I introduce today's speaker, I will point out the next upcoming two talks. Next week, we will have an in-person talk on campus and streaming. This will be Andy Euler and Mose Bushell, two journalists here in Austin, and they will give us journalist perspectives on reporting in the energy industry, largely centered on reporting about the energy industry here in Texas, but more broadly than that as well. And then following that, we will have a talk from General Motors' Rob Threlkeld on the path to zero emissions for GM's plans in that area. But today, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Weber. He's going to talk to us about small-scale liquefied natural gas export facilities. He's associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. So just to give us a little background here on our speaker, he researches policy and economics of environmental and energy issues. He has extensive policy experience working as a research economist at the Federal Statistical Agency of the Economic Research Service and as a chief economist at the White House as part of the Council of Economic Advisors. He has an international perspective as well, gained from field research in Brazil and Peru from working at the World Bank. So today's talk will be about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission ruling and the regulations around small-scale facilities that export liquefied natural gas via truck-sized containers and how these fall outside of their jurisdiction and how important is this to us. We're going to learn about, hear about the big tankers, and maybe we're going to hear about smaller scale sizes now. He's going to touch on links and incidents, environmental justice issues associated with citing these, and incidences in transport of liquefied natural gas. So with that said, I will now stop sharing and pass over to our speaker, Jeremy. And as always, I encourage everyone to submit questions via the Q&A, and we will address these at the end of Jeremy's talk after 40 or 45 minutes. So please submit them at any time. And Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Kerry, and thank you for the opportunity to present at the symposium and to be the first speaker of the spring semester. So this is a real privilege. And it's a great opportunity for me to highlight work that stems from a capstone class here at the University of Pittsburgh that I oversaw in the fall. And we worked with the GAO, the Federal Government Accountability Office, on a question that they had. And the essence of the question was this one: are small-scale LNG export facilities underregulated in the US? They didn't phrase it exactly like that, but that was the essence of the question. So their specific question was: are there gaps in oversight in the governance of small-scale LNG export facilities? And that question really was motivated by several observations. They had several citizens come forth and ask either at GAO or at a related agency a basic question about regulation of small-scale LNG facilities. And the basic concern is summarized in a petition filed to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where it was a petition by various watershed groups. And this was a statement here in the petition, quote, "There is no transparency or public involvement in the siting, construction, and operation of small-scale inland LNG export facilities." So GAO wanted to know, is that really true? Who has oversight, who doesn't have oversight, and is there an issue? it was a great opportunity for my students and for me to learn about the layers of federal involvement in this space. It was a lot to wade through, and I think we wrapped our minds around it about as well as you can in a semester. And I'll present now what we found and how we thought about the question or the task. Just to put into context what were the type of facilities that are in view here. This slide shows some details of the Hialeah facility. Goes by different names. It's in Hialeah, Florida, very close to Miami. It's very close to the coast, as you can see from the map. Its capacity is about 100,000 gallons of LNG a day. If you converted that into ISO containers, that would be about 10 containers. They sometimes transport by truck in containers, sometimes by train. They're serving different customers. They're exporting some, primarily to the Caribbean, and they're also serving domestic customers in Florida, LNG users who are not connected to a pipeline. So is it really the case that there's no public oversight or involvement in siting, construction, operation of these facilities? Well, to give you a sense of the regulatory landscape for LNG terminals, that's a key, LNG terminals. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, as I'll be referring to it, they carry out and are the lead federal agency for fulfillment of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is an act that is quite far-reaching in its implication, and it's basically if a federal action affects the environment, or if a decision has an intersection with the federal government's work, then a review of the environmental impacts of that federal action needs to be undertaken. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the essence. It's environmental reviews are required by the National Environmental Policy Act, and there's usually a lead federal agency that's coordinating with other agencies involved in the decision, whether it be permitting a pipeline or granting an export authorization permit. And then that lead agency oversees the process, which can require an extensive assessment of the environmental impacts, potential environmental impacts of the action being permitted. So FERC is the entity to do that for LNG terminals. Another agency or entity is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, which regulates and monitors both the construction standards, for example, of LNG facilities, and then their operation. So we've got FERC, we have PHMSA, and then the Department of Energy is also involved in this game, primarily through granting authorization to export, or to export to, more specifically, to non-free trade agreement countries. That requires DOE authorization. So there definitely is public involvement here. But so what is this? What were these environmental groups referring to? Well, it stems from a 2015 FERC decision involving a pivotal energy facility. And FERC ruled that small-scale facilities that export LNG by tanker, and I think that's what we're looking at here in this picture, a tanker of sorts. I don't know if that's LNG that's in those tankers. Oh, actually, I think it might be. One of my students found this picture. So this is LNG exported by container ship in these truck-sized containers. FERC says these facilities are not LNG export terminals if they're not directly loading a waterborne vessel. So if they're a quarter mile from the port and they fill up containers that then are trucked and loaded on to the ship by crane, as we see here. That's not an LNG export terminal. It's not an LNG terminal in the meaning of the Natural Gas Act. And therefore, such a facility wouldn't fall under the jurisdiction of FERC, wouldn't require its permitting, or better said, FERC wouldn't have a federal nexus, wouldn't have a nexus of involvement with that facility. Now, of course, this is significant because of FERC's role in applying NEPA. It's known as NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, to LNG terminals. So it removes FERC from that. Now, as I mentioned before, DOE has to grant authorization for exporting to non-free trade agreement countries. So that creates a federal nexus. However, DOE created what's called a categorical exclusion for small scale LNG export facilities below a certain threshold of liquefaction capacity or export volumes, I believe. They are categorically excluded from having to undergo an environmental assessment and review. Since the 2015 FERC decision, 11 entities or facilities have received approval for export by container. So we've gone from 0 exports of LNG via this small scale container-based method to more than 1 billion cubic feet in 2021. And that reached 6 countries, mostly in the Caribbean, a few in Central America as well. And it's likely to grow. That's not a massive volume, but this gives you some sense that not having to do this environmental review, not needing to involve FERC, may have been quite helpful, or an encouragement to certainly made it easier for these types of facilities to get into the export game. To give a sense of what those environmental reviews involve, in the last 8 or so years, FERC environmental reviews under NEPA have taken on average about 3 years. So that's just to complete your environmental review. So the whole project's held up for at least that amount of time. And there's public comment periods and things that go on outside of that timeline. So to give a bit more sense too of this distinction between a small scale facility and an LNG terminal, the terminals are where our US liquefied natural gas is really hitting the global market. It's the vast amount of LNG that we're exporting is via what's clearly a terminal. It's set up to load these large scale LNG tankers. Small scale facilities, again, they're not filling these tankers. They are filling containers. And those containers are sometimes serving international customers who are not equipped to receive a tanker like this. So these are smaller markets, smaller countries that just don't have that infrastructure, but they want the LNG. And the right way to think about these small scale facilities, as I was diving into it, is more of, think about a container of corn. Think about a corn farmer who produces corn, loads up rail cars, containers of corn. Well, that corn could go to many places. It could go to feedlots, could go to an ethanol plant, it could go to China. It might go to an intermediary, a merchant who's buying and aggregating some supply and then exporting it. That's more of the flavor of these small scale facilities, serving a diverse mix of customers wherever the market demand is the greatest. And that could be at home or that could be abroad. Whereas these large scale LNG terminals, this is clearly just for the export market. All right, now to go more to the question of the day, the charge that GAO gave us. Well, what problems are or is regulation of these facilities trying to solve? And you can think of several problems, one being environmental injustice in the siting of the facilities. There is a pattern for various industries of siting facilities, pollution-intensive facilities being located near lower income or minority communities. So there could be a concern that that happens in the case of liquefaction facilities or small-scale liquefaction facilities. And so regulation of the form of environmental review, which has extensive public comment, would be a one way of trying to avoid that pattern. And of course, there's the concern that such facilities invest too little in mitigating any environmental or health risks that come from the facilities. And the environmental risk being methane emissions, not just methane, but that's certainly from a global climate perspective, that's the main concern. There are other emissions that come from the process, nitrous oxides. And then there's the health and safety risk of an explosion coming from the facility or trucks leaving the facility loaded with LNG. And there's a picture here in the bottom right of the screen of an LNG explosion incident in Washington a few years ago. So it is a real concern or a real possibility. But as we dive in, we'll see just how real of a possibility. So these would be the type of issues that public involvement would be seeking to address. So our empirical question and our way to get at it is, absent FERC involvement and this environmental review process, are small-scale LNG export facilities underregulated? The risk that they're presenting just too high? And then related to that, would FERC involvement make a difference? Would it address that problem? And an important insight here for our empirics is that falling outside of FERC's jurisdiction just means that the small-scale export facility is now going to be regulated in the same way as a small-scale LNG facility that wasn't export oriented. A key here idea is that the small scale LNG exports are part of a broader small scale LNG world that has a regulatory structure and requirements. And to give you a bit of details about that, what we're defining as small-scale LNG facilities are permanent LNG facilities. There are mobile facilities that serve the oil and gas sector, for example. We're not talking about them. We're talking about permanent facilities that have liquefaction capacity, so you can't just be storage. And your liquefaction capacity is less than this 0.14 billion cubic feet per day, which is the DOE threshold for being categorically excluded from having to do a NEPA review. Why do these small-scale facilities exist? Well, in essence, they exist to shift natural gas across markets separated by either time or by space. So with time, liquefaction improves the economics of storage because liquefy, you reduce its volume. So you have liquefaction facilities that are called peaker facilities, where they're taking gas off the pipeline network in times of abundance, and they're storing it. Maybe also associated with a power generation facility. That would be where they're shifting the natural gas across time, across markets separated by time. But then you have other facilities who are or customers or niches where you're shifting the natural gas across space. You have a manufacturing facility that could use LNG and it's not connected to a pipeline, or could use natural gas and it's not connected to a pipeline. And so then it's more economical to serve that plant with LNG than with anything else. So these facilities serve a mix of economic roles and customers. How many are there? Well, applying this definition to the best data that we could get our hands on, there were 74 unique facilities meeting the definition and that operated at some point during the 2010-2021 period. So that's our universe of facilities. Now, our empirical questions more specifically relate to the siting risk, the operation risk, and then the transport risk. And for siting, we're asking of or for recently built facilities, is there an evidence that these are being sited disproportionately in lower income, higher minority communities? For operations risk, how frequently do these facilities leak? And importantly, do they leak less when there's FERC involvement? And then lastly, the transport risk. How frequently is there an incident related to trucking LNG from a facility? All right, so we're going to go through each one of these areas and just bring the best data that we could find to bear on the question. Starting with this siting risk, we had 11 small-scale facilities built during the 2010-2021 period. None of them fell within FERC jurisdiction, either because they weren't directly loading waterborne vessels or because they weren't connected to an interstate pipeline or otherwise meet the criteria for FERC jurisdiction. So none of them had FERC jurisdiction, which in a way is nice because then, if they don't have an issue in siting, then FERC involvement can't address a problem that doesn't exist. We're going to be using census tract information on percentage of residents that are low income or percentage of residents that are non-white. And we're simply asking, does the host tract, the tract where the facility was built, does it have a greater percentage of minority or low income residents than neighboring tracts, either tracts whose centroid is within 5 miles or tracts whose centroid is 5 to 10 miles away from the host? Here's a map of these small-scale LNG facilities, not necessarily export facilities. Clearly, the Pennsylvania facility in Manning, that's not an export facility. So these facilities are diverse in nature. There were 11 of them, as you can see, and they were spread across the country. Obviously, a cluster towards the Gulf Coast, but there's a decent geographic distribution. Here's what we found. Within a vicinity, so a given small region of a state, firms are not disproportionately siting facilities in the lower income or higher minority tracts within that general vicinity. And why do I say that? Well, in 7 of our 10 cases, it turns out the North Dakota facility doesn't have any neighbors, really. It's really large, and so you have to go really far before you get other tracts. So we're not including that here. But in 7 of the 10 cases, the neighboring tracts actually had a higher percentage of low-income residents or minorities, which is the opposite of the environmental injustice pattern. In 8 of the 10 cases, I'm sorry, it was 7 of 10 cases that further away had more low income. In 8 of 10 cases, further away had more minorities. And then you can think about this quantitatively a different way of just looking at the difference in the percentage of residents in the category across host and neighbors, and whether you look at the mean or median difference in percentage, you get the same story. It's generally lower income the further you get away from the facility, or more minority. not super strong patterns, but certainly not in the same direction that we would expect if there was the environmental injustice pattern. So here's an implication and a caveat to this one is if recently built facilities aren't being disproportionately cited in environmental justice communities, then FERC involvement wouldn't solve a problem that's not there. Maybe that's a little strong because of a statement, because we're not looking at within a state, for example, are lower income portions of the state receiving the facility. We're thinking of it more of, you decide, I generally want to be in this area to build my small scale LNG facility. And then the question is, within that area that meets your basic requirements, are you sorting or citing it in the lower or lowest income area? And that's what we don't see. But you might see that it's the lower income half of the state that's receiving the facility. The meaning of the interpretation of that's a little bit more murky when you go to that broader scale, but that could be happening. Another caveat is that the risk associated with transportation and the pollution associated with the truck traffic, that might be falling on lower income residents disproportionately, depending on the trucking routes used by the facilities. And we didn't map out the trucking routes. That would have been very difficult to do. So that's a caveat here. All right, moving on to the leaks from these small scale LNG facilities. How frequently do they leak? And does FERC involvement reduce the leak rate? So here's the data we brought to bear on this question. We're using annual reports that operators of the LNG facilities are required to submit to PHMSA. This is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. That gave us 687 facility year observations over this 2010 to 2021 period. Turns out a little more than a fifth of these facility year observations were under FERC jurisdiction, meaning they had been cited under and approved under the oversight of FERC. And again, this was either because they fell under the FERC jurisdiction of an LNG terminal, or the FERC jurisdiction because of their involvement with interstate transport of natural gas. So here's what we find: the leak rate, just unconditional, years of operation and leaks. What does that look like? It's 1 in 4 years that you have a leak. And let me move my picture here so I can see my slide a little better. Okay. So it's 1 in 4 years that you have a leak, and this is a leak of any size, really. And then 1 in 70 years that you have an incident. And the way PHMSA defines an incident could be something other than a leak, or it could be a big leak. So if the leak is above a threshold of quantity of gas leaked, then it would be an incident. And it turns out those incidents are quite rare. There's only 1 every 70 years by as shown by the data. FERC jurisdiction facilities do not have lower leak rates on average. In fact, in conditional terms, they had a slightly higher leak rate. I don't know if that's just a real difference, pretty imprecisely estimated, but certainly not consistent with the idea that FERC involvement in siting is key to reducing leak rates. Again, just do not see that FERC jurisdiction facilities have lower leak rates, either conditionally or either unconditionally or conditional on how old is the facility, what type of facility is it, what state is it in. We also don't see that FERC facilities have lower incident rates. These are the more serious, they're leaks or some other problem that had, for example, required an emergency shutdown. Now, taking a step back and thinking about the institutions are surrounding this issue of leaks and risk, it shouldn't be surprising that FERC involvement isn't affecting leak rates. And that's because the involvement and the NEPA review is really ex ante. It's not involved in the operation of the facility. It doesn't come to bear in the operation of the facility. Operations are still regulated and monitored by PHMSA, regardless of whether FERC carried out an environmental impact statement prior to the operation of the facility. It does seem like the leak rate and the incident rate are low, 1 in 4 years for any type of leak. But a caveat there is these leaks and the incident reports, they are self-reported. The operators are legally mandated under threat of fines to report this information, but the information is not being, it's not as if there's a PHMSA person there every day observing everything and recording any leak. This is data coming from the operators themselves. And another thing to note is that these incidents can be substantial in scale. And that picture that I showed earlier illustrates it. This is the 2014 Plymouth, Washington, a small-scale liquefaction facility had a massive explosion. There we go. This looks like Bakhmut or somewhere in Ukraine right now. Could be just tremendous devastation. It was, you read the newspaper articles and people say it was a miracle nobody was killed in here. There was some injuries, but nobody was killed, though it certainly could have occurred. Now that's one such incident in I don't know how far back you have to go to see a similar size or a similar incident, an incident with similar devastation. So these things are not happening every year or even every decade, but they can happen. All right, then moving on to the transport risk. What's the risk of incidents for transporting LNG by truck? We were just talking about incidents in the operation of the LNG facility, the bringing in of the gas from the pipeline, the liquefying of it, and putting that back, putting that into a storage somewhere, or putting that onto a truck or into another pipeline. That's what we were just talking about. But now these are trucking incidents, and a trucking incident, also defined by PHMSA here, is where a death, injury, evacuation, shutdown, or alteration of an aircraft flight pattern occurs as direct result of a hazardous material, or any situation that warrants a report. To have a catch-all phrase. The data that we're using to look at this are from the PHMSA Hazmat Incident Report Search Tool, and we're going through there and selecting the proper filters to net all of the LNG transport incidents. So we're throwing out CNG incidents, propane incidents, and we're just focused on an incident involving a truck carrying LNG. Turns out there was 11 incidents over this 2010 to 2021 period. From the leak and the operations data, we know that during that time, we had 687 facility years worth of small scale facility operations. So if we just do the math on that, that means 0.016 incidents per year, trucking incidents, or roughly once every 60 years. Now, implications and caveats there. This 1 in 60 years, in one sense, probably overstates the transport incident risk associated with small-scale LNG facilities, because we don't actually know if that LNG transport was related to a small scale LNG facility. You know, potentially could have come in on a tanker, been imported, stored, and then carried by truck, in which case it would have had no involvement with a small scale liquefaction facility. So we were attributing all these incidents to small scale LNG facilities, and that's probably not a bad approximation, because most of the trucks loaded with LNG are probably from smaller scale facilities, but it is on that issue alone, it can only be accurate or an overstatement of risk. Another caveat is we're ignoring other harms associated with truck traffic. So you're not going to get an incident report if just the trucks, you know, going back and forth from the customer to the liquefaction facility are generating a lot of noise and exhaust. That's not an incident, so that's not considered here. More generally, an issue or a critique, you could say, or limitation of our study approach is that small-scale LNG export facilities, they could entail different risks than the general small-scale LNG facility population. We are using that that inference or that comparison in our empirics. We're saying, hey, you know, an LNG facility is an LNG facility. Whether or not its LNG ultimately goes, you know, to South Florida or to the Dominican Republic is immaterial. They're fundamentally the same things, just that their customers might be located in different places. That could be that generalization might be missing some subtle differences. You could have, you know, maybe these export facilities are right by the coast, and their transport routes are going to be very concentrated, just going back, higher volume and going back and forth on the exact same route heavily. So there might be some differences in risk, and we gloss over them to some extent. We're also not considering all risk and disamenities of LNG facilities. I think we're getting the main ones. You know, a facility just gets kind of dumped in the backyard of some lower income community. A facility is leaking a lot, creating, you know, methane vapor clouds, or, you know, these trucks are barreling down the local roads and running into people and stuff's exploding. We're covering that. All right, some takeaways from this work. Move my picture again here. FERC jurisdiction and the environmental assessment required by the National Environmental Policy Act is unlikely to reduce risk of environmental injustice in siting or risk from leaks and incidents in operation or transport. I think that's pretty well supported by the analysis we've done. However, the NEPA process, the studying, the involvement of stakeholders, the public comment, certainly would increase opportunity for the public, or if you want to put it differently, interest groups to insert themselves and influence, to make comments on the facilities and get it in the public record and bring attention to it. So FERC involvement would bring that about, likely. It would also absorb federal staff time. So these NEPA reviews are done by federal agencies and federal staff. So, and they're extensive. There's a reason why they take 3 years on average, or the FERC ones took 3 years on average. They can take much longer. That's absorbing federal staff time. It's certainly increasing private costs, perhaps substantially, if we're inferring that part of the reason why there wasn't this, or why there's been this uptick in exports in entities or facilities seeking export authorization is because, wow, if we are this type of facility, we can avoid having to go through a FERC NEPA process. So we don't have to wait around for 3 years and spend a lot of money on lawyers and back and forth and have the whole thing nixed potentially at the end of those 3 years. So there are private costs certainly involved in NEPA. And that brings me to my last point, and that is, I think, a big one. This is a research topic. Our research question is fairly narrow, but it touches on this massive public policy, environmental policy question, and that is the various costs and benefits of federal environmental reviews for energy infrastructure. These reviews can take a lot of time. They can generate a lot of information for decision makers, but just because reports are being done and assessments are being made does not guarantee that better policy is happening. That environmentally or quality of life, that we're getting much for all of the effort and delay of a NEPA review. If an infrastructure, something that was needing permit, if that was a social welfare improving investment, let's say a bridge, a pipeline, a wind farm, if that was a social welfare improving investment, and you throw in a 4-year environmental review, we've left some money on the table there, because those benefits, those net benefits of that investment, of that infrastructure, are now pushed into the future. So we're under the old infrastructure regime for more years, and those net benefits are just pushed out. And so there is a potential for, I think, some net benefits to either reducing the scope or cases where to apply for the National Environmental Policy Act situations to apply. But it's an empirical question, what we're getting from the environmental reviews. And I think it's a great one. It's one that's not well studied, for good reason. It's not a clean empirical question or conceptual question, but I think an important one. And in fact, in this case of small-scale LNG facilities, you actually have some decent variation in facilities that did or did not have to go through a NEPA process because of the kind of very particular boundaries of FERC jurisdiction. They have a very particular definition of what it means to engage in interstate transportation. And now we have a very particular definition of what it means to be an LNG terminal. And you can be pretty close to falling into FERC jurisdiction and to not fall into it, and therefore not need NEPA. And so that does give you some interesting variation in facilities that did and did not have to go through have the National Environmental Policy Act apply to their facility. And with that, I'm going to end so that we can have some time for discussion and any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. So there's a few questions here on the chat. The first couple by the same person that I'll try to summarize. I don't know if you're looking at them. It's the person who's involved in, I guess, litigation, perhaps regarding these types of facilities. Now go to the end of the sort of summary and statement here of one particular export facility that has 3 liquefaction trains 1,300 feet from an export dock, and has successfully argued, I guess to date, or did, that to FERC that this 1,300-foot gap severs their jurisdiction. It's far enough from the tanker where they're loading, so there's the concern here is this could lead to a wave of copycats of people citing facilities specifically because they found a method to avoid FERC jurisdiction yet still be close to, I suppose, a waterborne export in this case. you have any insights into this about, these distances, and do you know of this case? And
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, this case did come up, and I think it's important to clarify two different types of questions. And one is, what does the Natural Gas Act actually read, and what is the proper interpretation of it? If a facility, by law, a facility that meets that definition, then FERC needs to be involved by law. That's a different question from saying, practically, what does FERC involvement get you? If there were no laws and we're just saying, should we regulate or not, or should we have this type of FERC involvement? That's more of an empirical question. And you mentioned here in your comment about the impact of the facility is broader than leak rates and so on. And fair point. The impact of various facilities is oftentimes far beyond what's happening at the actual site. It's the market implications of what they're producing. It's the consumers they're serving, and how their behavior is changing in response to being served by a facility. So, for example, the environmental implications of a small-scale LNG facility would certainly include, if that facility were not exporting the LNG to the Dominican Republic or Haiti, what would they be using as an alternative? Is it wind power, or is it diesel fuel generators? I don't know, but that's a fair point. The environmental implications of facilities certainly can go beyond the site. But our research was really focused not on the legal question, because obviously the lawyers could spend a lot of time discussing whether or not FERC is properly interpreting the Natural Gas Act. We leave that question aside for them to navigate, and we're simply looking at, well, what are the leak rates? What are the patterns in siting in recent history? How frequent are incidents associated with transport of LNG by truck? And I'll stop there so we get to some other questions.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thanks. One question here, I guess, kind of asking for clarification or any other potential insights on the variety of sizes of these small scale facilities. You put in 1 BCF a day, or in your, or I don't know, about a year in your presentation, and you mentioned this facility in Miami, but just any other insights into the different sites here?
Tim has a fair point here. The facilities can vary. Some of these facilities, their liquefaction capacity is very tiny. It's 0.0, a lot of zeros before you get to a digit. And others bunch right up at the 0.14 DOE. And so it does vary in scale, though, that range of scale from, 0.00 whatever BCF per day to the 0.14 is dwarfed by the scale of the kind of standard LNG export facilities that are in the several billion cubic feet per day. Now when we did our leak analysis, look at scale effects. Are you getting more leaks per BCF at different ranges? And it's not included in the main analysis, but you definitely have some nonlinearities there, but they're not massive nonlinearities in size. And at the end, I think it was a little bit difficult to think about putting in these massive liquefaction facilities that are kind of 100 times larger as other facilities on the same playing field when estimating risk. And so we ended up just focusing on learning about small-scale LNG export facilities by looking only at other small-scale LNG facilities, not by looking at all LNG facilities, partly to reduce the heterogeneity in scale and potential heterogeneity in other things that we're not observing.
Right. Thanks for that. So this next question, kind of following up on your conclusions at FERC, or just statement, I guess, FERC's jurisdiction, they're involved in siting and they don't have a particular role in operations of these facilities. So maybe the question person here is essentially stating, well, companies don't have any incentive, at least through FERC, to have better operations. But what are the other relevant jurisdictions, or at least agencies, that would relate to operational concerns? Is that the PHMSA, Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration, or others? Yeah.
And FERC would be the lead agency in overseeing the siting. It's not the only agency. So PHMSA would be involved with that. And then PHMSA continues on with monitoring compliance with federal standards for hazardous material for LNG facilities. So there is federal involvement after FERC kind of completes the federal NEPA review. And I just want to go back to Tyson made a comment about precedents for the FERC case, and this is a fair point, and I'm not making any statement here about whether or not FERC in its 2015 decision is properly reading the Natural Gas Act. Setting that all aside, the statement here that in Florida none of the state or local government regulatory functions come close to performing the comprehensive NEPA assessments that FERC perform. I think that's a fair statement. FERC reviews are extensive. All right, so the local government in Hialeah we shouldn't expect them to do that scale of environmental assessment. I think that's fair. That said, we did document that in many places where these facilities exist, there are zoning regulations, and so these facilities have to be sited in zones that are for industrial, whatever the zoning code requires. Only the LNG facilities can only go into those zones where such facilities are allowed to be. That's certainly not doing the same thing as a NEPA review. But again, our bigger point question is, what do you seem to be getting from that NEPA review as far as practical differences in leak rates or incidents? And going on further down, if small-scale LNG facilities to become an exporting facility, does it have to fall under FERC jurisdiction? NEPA DOE to start exporting.
Yeah, maybe you can just clarify exactly what kind of determinations are to be made for a small-scale facility to be exporting, or you're kind of saying it's not particularly special if it exports to a foreign entity versus domestic and is on trucks. They're essentially saying there is no difference in terms of a regulatory agency.
They would need, the person exporting or the entity exporting needs to have authorization from the DOE to export to a non-free trade agreement country. And what's fascinating, and we found, is that 3 or 4 of the 11 authorizations granted since 2015 are for entities that don't have any liquefaction facility. They're just merchants. So this is why my analogy with the corn container, corn brokers, you have LNG brokers, and they might decide, wow, we've got a great opportunity. Let's move this LNG internationally. So I've got a buyer in the Caribbean, or we have use in somewhere here in the United States, and that determines where the containers are going. If they decide to go, or they want the option of going internationally, particularly to a non-free trade agreement country, they're going to need DOE authorization. But as far as a merchant engaged in that, I think they would probably only need that authorization from DOE, Office of Fossil Energy. I don't think they would need anything else. Of course, the entities transporting the LNG container would need to have be in compliance with federal motor carrier CASA regulations to be approved to carry that, but that wouldn't be the merchant's business at that point. They would just need the DOE authorization.
Right. They just get a container and then they move the container somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And it looks like Andrew's got a question here. Given
Yeah, go for that.
the strong hydrogen incentives, are there lessons we can learn from your work on small scale LNG about managing risk in society and regulating future hydrogen facilities? That's a really great question. And we actually thought first about approaching this question from simply a comparative perspective. What is a small scale LNG facility most like? And then look at what sort of a regulatory environment do they have? Is it more stringent, more involved, less involved than LNG facilities? And try to gauge what is the proper degree of regulation, or at least what's accepted in other domains as maybe an insight into what may be acceptable in the LNG domain. And so I think that is kind of where your question points to is, are these LNG facilities sufficiently similar and the risks that they present to, say, a hydrogen facility that the basic regulatory structure that you have for one, you might want for the other. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know hydrogen, facilities, how they would differ from a liquefaction facility. It would seem that there's a lot of similarities, but the explosivity of hydrogen relative to LNG, the hazmat rating might be quite different, and that might warrant different regulations. But that's a great question, great thought.
Right. I might read this one at the end here. It's a kind of a follow-up to your, I think, earlier statement here in the Q&A. I'll just read it for the audience. This is a person knowledgeable here and involved in this kind of issues. Section 311B, the 2005 Energy Policy Act, claimed incorporates 8 separate and distinct activities under its definition of a quote LNG terminal. So what is an LNG terminal? And then that wording, Jeremy, you can respond whether this, is a trigger word for it to be involved. And so the definition of the Energy Policy Act says here, LNG terminal covers, quote, all natural gas facilities located onshore or in state waters that are used to receive, unload, load, store, transport, gasify, liquefy, or process natural gas that is eventually exported to a foreign country from the United States. So in principle, this person is saying under the Energy Policy Act 2005, an LNG terminal is even someone who just takes a container full of LNG and then moves it somewhere else. And do you think this is being, I don't know, any other comment, or this is being sufficiently addressed, or, for clarifications for FERC, or go ahead.
Well, I just think from an analytical perspective, it's helpful to separate the two questions, the legal question from the policy question. So the thought experiment that I'm encouraging is, imagine you're writing the Energy Policy Act. Imagine you're writing the policy that determines regulation of LNG facilities in general, whether or not they export or not, to manage safety risks, siting risk, and so on. What should that look like? That's the question that I'm answering. You've got the pen, you're writing the law, not given the law has been written, should FERC do that or not? That question, empirics are largely irrelevant. I mean, LNG facilities could have no risk at all, and yet have to fall under FERC and have to do an environmental review just by law. But that, again, that's a very different question to what I'm asking.
Right. Well, I think we'll end it there. So thank you, everyone, for your very somewhat knowledgeable and insightful questions. And thank you, Jeremy, for
well, it's heavy hitters here. I expected that, so it's lived up to my expectations for the
right. I'm glad
I had to bring. So I needed to be awake today for this presentation.
Good. Well, we gave you the afternoon, plenty of time to wake up. So thank you again, Jeremy Weber, Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at University of Pittsburgh. Thank